If you've been reading the news lately, you might have heard about the debate on whether or not Europe should use Russia's frozen assets to fund Ukraine. You may also have read about, the disagreement between Belgium and the rest of the EU on how exactly this plan should work out. So I'm going to try to explain this in more detail. So the root of the problem is that Ukraine desperately needs more money. In 2026, their budget will have an 18% deficit, and of course, because they are channeling all their money to the military to defend themselves against the Russian invasion. And so they need financial aid from their allies. But after Trump's return to the White House, the financial aid from the United States has decreased. And so now it's more and more up to Europe to solely supply Ukraine. The problem, of course, is that Ukraine needs a lot of money, and the question is where the EU will get that money. And one solution is to use the Russian frozen assets that were frozen in the beginning of the war when Russia invaded. So these are Russian assets that were in Europe at the start of the war and then were frozen, so they can't be accessed by Russia, as a sanction for starting the war. But they haven't been seized, so they're just frozen, sitting there. And as you can see, most of the money is in Belgium. It's about, I think, like 140 or 150 billion euros, so a lot of money. And then the question is, should the EU just take this frozen Russian money and give it to Ukraine? That is sort of not an option because they risk breaking international law. And more importantly, it kind of makes other countries afraid of having their money in Europe, because if they see that a foreign country's assets can be seized, then why wouldn't the EU, in the future, if there is a conflict with the EU, seize their money? And so the EU, wants to avoid creating this effect where every other country, removes their assets, their reserves from the EU, which would, of course, heavily damage the EU's, global position. And so the plan is instead to take these 140 billion who are in a Belgian company called Euroclear. So most of the frozen money is in Euroclear, and this company is seated in Belgium. So the plan is that they take out a loan, Euroclear takes out a loan using this 140 billion as collateral, and they give this loan to Ukraine with 0% interest. And so in this way, they're not seizing the money. The Russian assets are still there, frozen, not seized, but you are using this money to take out a loan and giving that loan to Ukraine. And then the idea is that after the war, Russia will have to pay war reparations to Ukraine. And so the idea is that since Russia will have to pay war reparations anyway, this is kind of like an advance on the reparations. So when the Ukraine gets the reparations after the war, they can pay Euroclear back. So then, the money were never seized, they were just used for a loan. They will be paid back by Russian reparations after the war. This, of course, hinges on the Russians actually paying any reparations after the war. And I don't know how they will force Russia to do that if they don't, lose spectacularly. But I also think the EU has said that if Russia doesn't pay the reparations, Ukraine won't have to pay back the loan. Then it's unclear how will Euroclear be paid back, and how will they? No, it's complicated, but the benefit of this plan is that the assets are technically never seized, just used as collateral. Ukraine gets its funding, and there's no cost for EU taxpayers. If the EU didn't use the Russian assets, they would have to give Ukraine aid directly from their own budgets, and then they would have to either take out a loan for that themselves, or cut something else, or raise taxes, or it would be painful, So this is why most people want this solution. So the problem is that Belgium is not really on board with this solution. The reason being that Belgium wants guarantees. So this is the Belgian Prime Minister, Bart de Wever, and he means there are a lot of legal risk just for Belgium, because what if Russia goes to an international court and wins? If Belgium is ruled to have acted incorrectly according to international law, since it's illegal to seize foreign assets, and since this could be ruled to, in effect, be, the seizing of assets, and then Belgium would have to, pay it back, and since this amount of money amounts to I think a third of Belgium's GDP, it would be a catastrophe, and so they want the other European states to share the risk with them. So they're saying, okay, we can go along with this plan, but then all other European states have to promise that if this goes to shit, then you will share the burden with us, and you will, pay if there, ever comes a situation where Belgium has to pay for this. And I think this is quite reasonable. If they want this solution, then of course one country can't take all the risk. So then the EU kind of pinky promised, yeah, well, okay, we will promise, but there's no legally binding agreement, and that is what De Wever wants. He wants a legally binding agreement, not just fancy words. So this is where we are right now. This I wouldn't call it conflict, but this agreement between Belgium, between De Wever and the European Commission and the other European member states. So right now they are discussing, making this agreement. And as far as I know, the European Council will meet to decide on this on the 18th of December. And it's unlikely that every country will agree to share the risks. For example, Hungary probably will not accept this, but as long as the biggest economies like France, Germany, and so on, and the majority of the member states sign on to an agreement like this, then I think Belgium would accept it, and that the Russian assets could be used. One final thing I thought was interesting also is that during this time, the US has been negotiating with Russia, it seems, and more negotiating for Russia against Ukraine, considering how their 28-point peace plan is basically just Russia's demands. But in this plan, the US notes that these 100 billion in frozen Russian assets should be invested in US-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine, and that the US should receive 50% of the profits from this venture. So the US, in their recent negotiations, are kind of eyeing this cash. So that's made the EU even more, even more stressed that what the fuck is the US talking about? Because that would be a catastrophe, if somehow this cash, got invested to, give the US profits. So that has kind of sped up the process a bit, with Europe wanting to get this done, making a deal after their own, after their own interests, and making sure that this money is completely within European hands, and that they can use this money as kind of a leverage in getting a seat at future negotiations. Because in these current ongoing negotiations between first only the US and Russia, and then between the US and Ukraine, Europe hasn't really gotten a role. And so with these billions of dollars, maybe the Europe could get more influence in the negotiations if they could decide on using these assets. But that is to be seen.